So a huge thanks to everybody and for turning up today. And I'd just like to say a great thanks to Kimberley Abbott, who is the CAO and the founder of Vested Impact. And Kim, if you could just introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining today, and thanks to the ODI. So I'm Kim. I'm the founder and CEO of Vested Impact. We're a data company that works in the sustainability and impact data space. You'll hear a little bit more about what we do later, but mainly so I can talk about some of our data practices and some of our challenges. But I look forward to also hearing your questions later on.
Great, thanks, Kim. And over to you, Andrew and Mike, if you'd like to introduce yourselves, and then we can start with your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jo. I'm Andrew Newman. I'm the Principal Data Specialist here at the ODI. I lead our work on data assurance, which at the moment we're focusing on assuring the data practices of organisations. And Mike has been helping us deliver that. Mike, do you want to say hi?
Thanks, Andrew. So absolutely, I've been working on this project with Andrew. I'm an ODI associate. My background's around intellectual property rights and how they manifest and impact data and digital stuff.
Great, thanks, Mike. So I will pick up here and I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we're doing at ODI, and then I'll hand over to Kim. So Sam, let's have the next slide and the next one. So here at ODI, we help organisations realise the potential of data. We work with a range of organisations across the public, private and third sector, and we help leaders in those organisations understand the value of data and the issues that they might face in managing that data. We do this by providing a whole load of research, learning, consulting services that help organisations improve their data practices, and we influence government through our public policy work. We convene organisations and we provide safe spaces for those organisations to think about data and to think about how they can be better with data. The ODI is not-for-profit, and we're a mission-led organisation. We have a strong vision. So they're on the next slide, Sam. So our ultimate aim is that we want to create a world where data works for everyone. And what does that mean? Well, we want to see a world where the kind of corporate interests are balanced with individual rights, where access to data is equitable and fair, and where data is used responsibly and trustworthily. And to achieve this vision, our mission is to work towards an open, trustworthy data ecosystem. One of the things that we've been thinking about through our work is that actually we have never done anything to define what we mean by trustworthy. So if we just, we've already skipped to the next slide. Thanks, Sam. So we know from engaging with our members and our clients that trust and trustworthiness are really the essential foundations for a strong data ecosystem. That's why it's in our mission. And we also know that without trust, it's impossible to create conditions for data collection, use and sharing that deliver social, economic and environmental value. We know that access to trustworthy sources of data drives economic growth, societal improvement and environmental security. And we know that it's essential for building capable artificial intelligence and automated digital systems in the future. And we've all seen the articles in the news about how AI is sucking up the world's data and how that isn't fair and how that isn't equitable and how people are concerned about that. There's a really big theme in here about giving people permission to use data, I think. Essentially, trust in organisations' methods for collecting, using and sharing data is becoming increasingly important across society and the economy, and organisations that fail to demonstrate good practices when they collect, use and share data are generally seen to be less trusted. So ODI's been doing a huge amount of research into this, and we've been looking at this throughout the kind of history of ODI. And if you just jump to the next slide, Sam, you can see some of the research that we've been doing. This is probably over the last 3 or 4 years, actually. So on our website, we've got a whole stack of resources around data assurance. We've done some work to understand what data assurance is and why it's needed. We've reviewed the data assurance market in the UK, and we've kind of looked at what the market for data assurance internationally looks like. And what we've realised through this research is that actually data assurance has 2 parts to it, essentially. First of all, you need to assure the data. And secondly, you need to assure the organisations that look after that data and curate that data. ODI has chosen to initially focus on the organizational level. So the work that I'm going to talk about next is about assuring the organizational practices that are in place for data. So if we just jump to the next slide. Slides have disappeared. There we go. I think it's worth flagging at this point that before we introduce the work that we've been doing, that actually we know there are already lots of technical frameworks for data management. We know there are lots of maturity models that exist in the market already, and we know that organizations can use these to benchmark how they work with data. But what we've identified is there is a gap between these technical frameworks and the strategic considerations that organizations need to make to be trustworthy with data. So one of the use cases that we have for the work that we're going to present is translating that technical data management knowledge into something that can be understood in the C-suite, or something that can be understood by someone you're seeking to share data with who may not be as technically advanced as you. So to fill these gaps, we've devised a set of practices and tools to underpin the collection, use and sharing of data. So if we jump to the next slide, we can have a look at the practices. We've defined a set of 9 organizational practices for data. These are based on our research. In the first instance, we've looked at how these practices can help organizations understand if they're trustworthy with data and how they can improve their trustworthiness, but they are more widely applicable. The data practices have been designed to fill the gap between those strategic aims and real-world data collection, use and sharing. They've been designed to complement those existing frameworks that exist. And they've been designed to be understood by everybody, enabling everyone in an organization to describe what data practices looks like for them. For each of the data we've produced a guide to data practices, and for each data practice that includes a statement, it includes a definition, it includes a statement to help the C-suite understand why the practice matters, and it includes a set of implications. I'm going to hand over to Kim now, who's going to talk about her experience at Vested Impact. But after that, Abbas is going to join us, and he's going to talk about some of the products that we are building at ODI using the data practices. So Kim, I'll hand over to you there.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. So just to give everyone a little bit more context about what we do at Vested Impact, so you can understand, I guess, some of the examples and challenges we'll talk about. So as I mentioned, we are a data platform that automatically assesses and quantifies the outward impact that companies have. And we do this in a simplistic way of we pull in data about companies that might be open data or it can be reported data. We use a number of kind of machine learning models to kind of break down that unstructured data. And then we leverage over 200 million academic articles with an AI model that helps us attribute what companies do to what they have an impact on. And then we leverage over 100 million impact data points. Now, we call them impact data points, but it's open data. It's data from the UN, the World Bank, the OECD, these kind of organizations, which helps us then understand, in the context of what companies do and where, the degree of impact they have. The people and how our data is used is it's used by companies to help them understand what they have an impact on so they can improve. It's used a lot by financial institutions or organizations assessing their supply chains, because we can do large amounts a lot, but also by governments. We have the data, for example, we've just been given the data on over 8 million SMEs in Africa. So the potential of understanding what they do and where can help inform better decisions. But for us, as Andrew kind of set the scene, it is all about trust. Because as an organization, if our clients don't trust our data and trust us, we can't actually have the impact we want to have, which is we want people to make better decisions to improve their impacts on society or the environment. So ultimately for us, this is a huge part about building trust in our systems, in our data practices, and then overall in the products we have. So just next slide, thanks. So there is a lot in the media at the moment, obviously, about these big AI algorithms and models. And I think for many of us in the tech space, AI has actually been around quite a while. So of algorithms, it's just we've never quite had the amount of data that we now have to train these of. And we at Vested, we've always taken a belief and an approach that a simple algorithm trained off high quality data, practices, and infrastructure delivers far more value than a crazy, amazing algorithm that has, you know, rubbish data underneath, or poor data practices, or things that you can't validate, verify, or be accurate on. So that's a principle that we take, and one that we kind of believe in, but also obviously a challenge that we'll talk about a little bit further. Next slide, thanks. So I'm going to touch on just 3 of those data practices that Andrew kind of set the scene on. I think we as an organization could talk across all of them. We have to protect client data, we pull in open data, but I'm going to touch on 3 that I think are most relevant to us. The first one is about standardization. If anyone has worked in the ESG or sustainability space, or many data spaces at the moment, there's a lot of talk about the need for standards or regulations and things like that. What we believe is obviously standardization is critical in your own process as an organization, but it doesn't mean you do it once and it stays static. And so that's a big one for us, is people worry about setting in place any standardization because they're worried that that is what they're stuck to. But for us, it's very much about going, what is the best practice we know now? And of course, we will review that and change that. So next slide, thanks. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that actually looks like for us. So when we talk about standardization at Vested, there is a lot of talk about needing to have, you know, common data points, right? We all need to measure carbon with metric tons. That's a pretty agreed one, right? But it becomes a very difficult question when we start to talk about measuring social factors or broader things like, how do we assess what the impact on food security is? Because the data we might have on food security in Uganda is very different metrics and from different sources to what we would have in the UK. Now, the approach we take at Vested is that data should be flexible and specific, because we quite rightly wouldn't measure food security the same way in those different contexts. We probably wouldn't even measure it the same way for different types of products or services. But what we do need is a standard process and framework for how we then apply these context-specific data points. So that's really important for us at Vested. We have a standardized framework of what we assess and where, but what we then apply is kind of context-specific and flexible data underneath, which makes it relevant, but also means there is consistency in kind of how we handle the whole process. The second thing for us, as I mentioned about, you know, we are very transparent. It's key to us that we share our methodology, those frameworks, and those points. But it is something that we review regularly. And I think that's okay. And we actually find most of our clients are okay when we come back and say, hey, we learned something new. We got some feedback from the UN. They've told us that actually, like, let's tweak it here. And so we obviously just make sure we document that. But the fact that it is always reviewed means the standardization doesn't become a limit for us. It actually becomes a trust building thing. And the final thing we do, so I mentioned we use hundreds of millions of data points. Now, we could lock all that away and say, you know, those final outputs that we calculate is kind of the value, which it is. But we provide all of the underlying data points as well as the links through to that data. Because we use open data, it gives us a slight advantage that we can link to the provenance of the data of where it comes from. But we also believe that it's very important for building trust, but for, you know, also attributing where data comes from, where it was accurate at the time we took it, and all those things. So next slide, thank you. So one of the biggest, probably the #1 challenge we face at Vested is actually that we have too much data and we probably give our customers too much data. You know, analysis paralysis is a word used quite a bit, right? And that was probably the first mistake we made as an organization. I went, we have hundreds of million data points. We're experts in measuring impact. Let's give organizations and the banks absolutely everything. And what we actually found was they couldn't make any decisions off it because there was too much. So just on the next slide, thanks. So this is where I think the pillar in the kind of data practices around, sorry, Sam, do you mind if we just switch to the next slide? But the data practices around engagement has actually been really key to us. Because as an organization, we obviously engage internally with each other. We can hold ourselves to account. We allow people to challenge the data. That's a very open and auditable process. But actually for us, it was honestly, there's been a lot of work in getting feedback on what data points are useful, what are good to have for provenance of data, but we need to kind of put to the back in an appendix, so to speak. So helping improve data literacy, which we live in a technical society, but still a challenge, is something we've had to work way harder than we probably anticipated as an organization, but also with the people that we work with. And I think I'm an engineer myself, and I think if there's any technical people on the call, documenting technical systems has been something that we've always done, but I don't think we've often done it in a way that makes it accessible to everyday people. We often like to write our algorithms in a way that sounds impressive, right? They sound like a phenomenal piece of technology. That doesn't build trust. People trust what they understand. So we've almost had to completely, sometimes it makes me sad. I read our documentation and I go, oh, that makes it sound so easy what we do. But actually, that should be the point. Anybody should be able to understand what data is being used to make what decisions, to calculate what. And whilst we thought that using big words would make us seem more oppressive, actually just being able to be well understood has been a bigger success. But it's taken a huge amount of effort for us. Next slide, which is just my last, the last key one I'll talk about is vested. One of our slogans is often that money doesn't change the world, the people who spend it do, because we try and shift investment into companies that do good. But the reality is the same with data. It's not the data, it's the decisions that are made off that data that are going to have the impact. And on the next slide is where ethics and data ethics is one of the big challenges we have. So just next slide, thanks, Sam. Because for us, once we give a client the data, we can't control how it's used. We can give them all the great data that says these are the great positive impacts this mining company might have, but we can also say, and here are all the negatives, but we can't control often what decision they make off that. We make a choice as an organization that as much as we use AI, it does not make decisions. We believe that technology should enable better decision making, but at the point we're at in society, it shouldn't yet make it. So what we have to do as an organization, because we can't control our customers, is just have in place our own governance on what we believe are suitable use cases for what we do. Are we comfortable with how we think they're going to use them? And to try and get as much information as we can about how they do. Sometimes, like I say, we don't have any legal right to ask for that information, but building the good relationships can help us to just understand ourselves, because we want that data to be used in the right manner. And just the final point I'll sit on, because we work in the impact space. We talk about human lives, how many people's lives are impacted by what we do. But data is a number, and it doesn't always capture the lived experience of human beings, which I think is sometimes what is a topic of discussion. And that's something that we might assess the impact of companies as a very tangible example. We get NGOs and that reach out all the time and say, "Great, can you automate our impact monitoring?" And there is many we say no to, because we wouldn't do justice to the personal experiences and impacts they might have in tiny communities. So I think for us, and that can be reflected in other systems. It might be an employee platform where your data says everyone's happy, but talk to people. So that's just the final one I'll touch on what we do, but I'm sure there'll be other questions in a moment.
Great, thank you so much. That's so fascinating, so much to think about. Mike, did you have any questions that you were going to?
Oh yes, of course.
I've got some questions as well.
As if by magic. I'd just like to back up what you said there, Joe. That was really interesting, and actually seeing how you're starting to think about the practices in the context of vested was really interesting. My sort of first question is about the gap that you described. So that gap between the data experts and the non-experts and how they talk about data. And I just wondered, I mean, the example that you gave, which was quite interesting, was around food security. You talked about food security experts, and you talked about the standards and metrics that you need to describe. So a data conversation with people that are experts somewhere else. Do you think that that's that kind of gap in understanding is endemic? So it happens everywhere, or do you think it happens more particularly in specific sectors?
I mean, I can't speak for all sectors, but I do think it somewhat happens everywhere. I think that's why we often get feedback from just why are big corporations so slow and fintech starter. And sometimes I think that there can be age discrepancies. There's often field discrepancies. I think in the ESG and sustainability space, it's very endemic and present everywhere. Because when we work with financial services, we've often seen and this was a few years ago, chief sustainability officer, for example, would have been a career banker. That was someone that maybe just cared a little about the environment and got given that role. So when you go in with experts on food security, we've got, my background's the UN, you don't speak the same language. And that's a learning curve. I think what we are seeing, though, is that gap is closing because these experts are, coming in now, and some of these organizations have phenomenal people that have to bridge a gap between sometimes the commercial interests and an impact one. But I think